is Louise Johnson from VARTA, the Victoria Assisted Reproduction Treatment Authority. And Louise is going to talk a little bit further, segueing beautifully from Ainsley's presentation to look at regulation, the law and mitochondrial donations. So quite a bit of law here this afternoon, which is good because I know Nancy's also got a law degree, so, you know, let's bring some lawyers in with the scientists and see what fun we can come up with. Hey? So, well, not lawyers, people with law degrees, sorry. Over to you, Louise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I actually have a science degree, so but I have studied some law as well of more recent times. I came into my position as CEO for VARTA with a science and management and education background, and then I decided I needed the law as well, so I went back to study. This afternoon I'm going to talk about regulation, the law and mitochondrial donation, and I think, and I would agree with Ainsley, I think there's got to be an interface between ethics and the law. So I'm going to just touch on a little bit of history, and I'm not going to dwell on what's happening in the UK for very long because there's people in this room who are far more expert in talking about what's been happening in the United Kingdom. But in February 2015, the United Kingdom Parliament approved regulations related to mitochondrial donation. And this is really the first country to really facilitate this through regulation. And it's certainly an area of hot debate in the United States, as previously discussed. And the HFEA is going to be charged with managing this with a two-stage licensing process for clinics from the 29th of October 2015. And I think we'll all be watching that space to see what eventuates. So, centres will be able to apply for a licence for the use of either maternal spindle transfer or pronuclear transfer for mitochondrial donation. And I know Nancy Lee is going to talk further about this. So any clinic wishing to apply for a licence, not only will they need to comply with the regulations, but they'll also need to demonstrate competence. And as I understand it at this point in time, there's the Newcastle Centre that has already demonstrated a lot of experience in this area, but there's very few other centres in the United Kingdom with the wealth of experience present in Newcastle. So with any law and regulations, there's usually a long period of time between the public debate, ethical consideration and development of law. And some years earlier, I won't say too much about this, but the Nuffield Council on Bioethics produced a report following some investigation and consultation that made a recommendation that there should be some processes, some regulatory processes to facilitate research in this area and possibly leading to clinical implementation. So what about in Australia? In Australia, it's far more complicated than in the UK. We had a federation model in relation to the law, and health law tends to be regulated by the states. However, as previously mentioned by other speakers, when Dolly the sheep was born, there was a lot of public debate and alarm, and the Commonwealth Government did legislate. And there were two acts, the Research Involving Human Embryos Act 2002 and the Prohibition of Human Cloning for Reproduction Act 2002. But then what needed to happen was that mirror bills needed to be introduced in different states throughout Australia. Western Australia didn't go down that track, but other states did. And in Victoria, mirror legislation wasn't introduced and passed until 2008. So there's been quite a long lead time between the Commonwealth taking action and states falling into line and introducing mirror legislation or not. And then there's a further complication of state legislation regulating the use of assisted reproductive treatment or technology. And some states have legislation and some don't, with notably Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia and South Australia having legislation which may interact as well with the mirror legislation that's been implemented in their state. So as in the UK, there's quite a long history, quite a long lead time for the development of law. There was the Lockhart Review, a legislative review committee appointed in 2005, chaired by Justice John Lockhart. And they made 54 recommendations which informed the legislation that we now have in place. But reading through their report, they envisaged that the creation of embryos for research containing DNA from more than 2 people could be facilitated under licence from the NHMRC Embryo Licensing Committee. There was discussion about the implantation into the reproductive tract of a woman of an embryo created with the genetic people from more than 2 people should continue to be prohibited. And there was little support at that time for the creation of embryos using human eggs and sperm for research. However, research involving fertilisation of human eggs by human sperm up to, but not including, the first cell division should be permitted by research. So that's that very early embryonic stage. And certainly that may help with research training and improvements in the clinical practice of ART. They talked about the older technique as referred to by Ainsley of cytoplasmic transfer, including the transfer of mitochondrial DNA. But at this point in time, it wasn't envisaged that there would be alternative techniques for the transfer of mitochondrial DNA. And what does that mean in terms of the legislation? They also looked at the definition of the embryo, and that also has an impact on how the legislation has been implemented. So a later report, chaired by the Honourable Peter Heery in 2011, acknowledged that there were some drawbacks with the legislation in the way it was drafted. And in that report, they acknowledged that research into mitochondrial DNA disorders has been restricted or limited by the combination of the clauses within the Research Involving Human Embryos Act and the Prohibition of Human Cloning Act that prohibit the creating, developing or using an embryo containing the genetic material from more than 2 people. They also acknowledged that in their report that if the nucleus of a fertilised egg is transferred into an enucleated unfertilised egg from a third party, creating an embryo with genetic information from 3 donors by a technique like somatic cell nuclear transfer, there's currently no offence if that's done under licence. And this would mean that it might be possible for pronuclear transfer, but certainly not for spindle transfer. So where are we now? In relation to the Prohibition for Human Cloning for Reproduction Act 2002, there's various sections that impact on what we can now do and what we can't. So it's an offence to create or develop a human embryo by fertilisation that contains genetic material provided by more than 2 people, and there's a penalty of 15 years. the creation of an embryo by other means with genetic material by more than 2 people might be possible under licence of research using the pro-nuclear transfer method. There's a prohibition on the creation of an embryo from an egg and a sperm outside of the body of a woman unless intended for a pregnancy. And you can't develop a human embryo outside the body for more than 14 days, regardless of how it's created, whether that be for research or for clinical use. And it means we can't do mitochondrial transfer for treatment purposes. So what about the Research Involving Human Embryos Act? It's an offence to use an embryo that contains the genetic material provided by more than 2 people without a licence from NHMRC, from the Research Licensing Committee. And if there was to be a licence granted for research or training involving fertilisation of a human egg by human sperm up to, not including the first mitotic division outside the body of a woman, it can only be done up to that stage of embryo development. And if you think about it, with IVF treatment, you've got transfer at either the 2 to 3 day stage, a cleavage stage embryo, where there'd be 4 to 8 cells in the embryo, and a blastocyst, you've already got 100 cells. So if you're talking about that very, very early stage, if you're wanting to do research that's going to possibly be of value for potential, with potential clinical outcomes, certainly the fertilisation stage would be very limited in relation to what might be possible under legislation. And there's somebody in the room from NHMRC, so they may have some comments on that later. So to further complicate things in Victoria, and I had a look at some of the other states that have legislation, it doesn't appear that the other states have clauses quite like this one. But within the Assisted Reproductive Treatment Act 2008 in Victoria, there's a ban on certain procedures. And you can't carry out a treatment procedure using sperm produced by more than one person or oocytes produced by more than one person. And the penalty is, quite considerable. And then if we look at the definition of a treatment procedure and look at the intersection of both those clauses in the legislation, a treatment procedure means artificial insemination other than self-insemination, or assisted reproductive treatment, which includes IVF and any other related treatment or procedure involving ICSI, which is where you inject the sperm directly into the egg. And as we've heard, you need 2 oocytes or eggs, and you need IVF technology needed for mitochondrial transfer treatment. So this would certainly also be prohibitive. So for to see this happen clinically, there'd need to be changes to Commonwealth legislation and state legislation in some instances. So the current situation, if we look at that, there's no legislative review that's been scheduled in the near future. And at this point in time, we've been informed that there's no research licences that have been issued to date through the NHMRC Embryo Research Licensing Committee for research that associated with mitochondrial transfer technology. So to sum up, as this cartoon shows, the situation illustrated in that cartoon is not yet possible in Australia. And I think it'll be really important to monitor the evidence and the research that's coming out of the UK and the United States to inform what should be done in Australia. there's obviously any policy discussion that might lead to legislative change will need to be informed by the evidence. It's really important that there's really strong public debate, and I think forums such as these are really important so that there is a conversation that's occurring around the countryside about these issues, that it's really important to have that public debate when we're looking at the issue of sensitive technology that can affect people's lives in such an amazing way. So that's really important. And again, looking at, as Ainsley's mentioned, a lot of legislation takes into account precautionary principles. So there needs to be protection of the public interest in the implementation of legislation that impacts on people's reproductive lives, that has such a strong social impact. And there needs to be consideration of what the balance is in relation to protection from harm, in consideration of the technology and how it should be regulated. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.